I'm Helena Cobban, the president of Just World Educational, a small but feisty nonprofit that works to build the informed public that's needed if we want to build a more just and sustainable world. Welcome to our webinar, Eating the Other, Toward Food Sovereignty in Palestine and the US, which we are presenting jointly with Grassroots International. I greet you today from my home office in the town called Washington, DC, located in the traditional lands of the Nacotchtanks and the Piscataways. Today's webinar is the first in our new series, Beyond Survival, which looks at food sovereignty challenges in Palestine and worldwide. This is the fourth webinar series we've presented this year. The earlier ones were on Syria, on the world after COVID, and on US-China relations. You can see the very content-rich resource pages we made as a result of those projects if you go to the resources tab on our website, www.justworldeducational.org. And we're also making an online resource page to collect and present the videos from the present series, so that the unique and informative conversation we present today and in the next session, December 12th, can be available for years to come to the people who weren't able to join us in real time at the webinars. I'm delighted that in preparing today's webinar, I was able to work with some deeply valued friends and colleagues, old and new. The project as a whole was conceived in discussions with my longtime colleagues, Maggie Schmitt and Laila El-Haddad, the authors of the groundbreaking Gaza Kitchen cookbook. As the publisher of this path-breaking volume, which is very much more than just a collection of recipes, I do apologize that it has been out of print for these past few months of the pandemic. But the book's third edition, which contains some fascinating new material, will be coming out in spring 2021. I have been very happy that Grassroots International, an organization with deep experience on food sovereignty issues worldwide, has worked closely with us on preparing this project. And indeed, their executive director, Chung-Wha will be moderating today's conversation. With her help, we also secured the participation of the two other panelists whom you will meet today, Chef Brit Reed and Jonathan Wilson, food justice specialists and practitioners whom we are honored to have also headlining our conversation today. Chung-Wha will be introducing all the panelists properly in just a minute, but I want to remind all of you attending today's webinar that my colleagues Amel Zaroug and Charlotte Cates will be sharing full resumes and some useful background info in the webinar's chat box as we go along. So it's probably a good idea to keep it open. And you should also use the chat box to submit the questions you have of the panelists. And now I'm going to formally hand over to Chung-Wha Hong. For over 25 years, Chung-Wha has worked on a range of social justice issues locally and internationally through organizing, policy advocacy, coalition building, and philanthropy. Named by New York Magazine as one of the most influential people in politics, before moving to Grassroots International, she spent years helping to build the political clout of New York State's immigrant communities through a comprehensive civic engagement program. And in the process, she helped to win numerous legal, social, and economic rights and benefits for those communities. So welcome to you, Chung-Wha Hong, and over to you.
Thank you so much. Good morning, good afternoon, good night for everyone joining us. And thank you, Helena, and your board member, Alice Rothschild, for inviting me to moderate what I know will be an amazing panel discussion on food sovereignty. I would like to begin by acknowledging that I live and work on unceded land of the Massachusetts people, also known as Boston. I pay my respects to the elders and to all Massachusetts people, past and present. As Helena said, I work at Grassroots International, and we're a public foundation that raises money from progressive donors in the US to support social movements in the Global South, including Palestine. Our focus is on defending land and territory, water, seeds, and food sovereignty. It's particularly fitting for us to be having this discussion the day before the International Day of Solidarity with the Palestinian people, which is tomorrow, and 2 days following the National Day of Mourning, or what is known as Thanksgiving to many in the US, because both have to do with violent histories of colonization, racism, expulsion, and genocide. But at the same time, they also show us vibrant trajectories of resistance. Playing a central role in these struggles, as well as Black and people of color struggles for land and liberation, is food. From the mass slaughter of buffalo in the US Plains region in an attempt to starve the indigenous people who relied on them, to the deprivation of food as a form of punishment and control under slavery, to the ongoing bulldozing of Palestinian olive groves cultivated over generations, there are countless examples of how food has been used as a tool of oppression. But food has also been central to emancipatory efforts, from the reclaiming of traditional foods and culinary practices, preserving of heirloom seeds over generations, to struggles in defense of territory. And this is what we're here to discuss today, focused on the theme of food sovereignty. Now, what is food sovereignty? This was one of the concepts that really blew my mind when I first learned of it. The most common definition coming from global social movements is the right of peoples to healthy and culturally appropriate food produced through ecologically sound and sustainable methods, and those people's right to define their own food and agriculture systems. At its essence, food sovereignty is about power, ultimately putting power back into the hands of those who grow our food and steward the land and water, and all of us who eat. Raj Patel has made the point that you could technically have food security while in prison or under dictatorship. In contrast, food sovereignty involves deeper questions of power, agency, ecology, culture, and identity. This concept of food sovereignty was first launched on the world stage by the global peasant movement, La Via Campesina, in 1996, outside of the World Food Summit in Rome. The context was a rise of the World Trade Organization and an onslaught of neoliberal policies of the 1990s. These were increasingly handing control of food system over to multinational corporations, while further disenfranchising the peasant, indigenous, and Afro-descendant communities responsible for producing the majority of the world's food. As world leaders met in Rome to discuss food security, La Via Campesina took to the streets, asserting that there could be no food security without food sovereignty. So food sovereignty has since continued to evolve as a concept and movement with diverse manifestations all over the globe. So today we'll explore food sovereignty in distinct yet deeply interconnected contexts, from the Palestinian struggle to indigenous resistance in Turtle Island to local farming and gardening projects in New York City. It is now an honor for me to introduce our amazing speakers who will lead us through the rest of the discussion. First, we have Laila El-Haddad, is co-editor of numerous books, Gaza Unsilenced, also author of Gaza Mom, Palestine, Politics, Parenting, and Everything Else in Between, and of course, co-author of the Gaza Kitchen, a Palestinian culinary journey, which was named Arab Cuisine Book of the Year in 2012 by Gourmand magazine. Laila is a powerful public speaker, as you will hear, an accomplished writer, political analyst, social activist, parent of 3, and a policy advisor for Al-Shabaka, the Palestinian Policy Network. And we have Maggie Schmitt, who is the co-author of the Gaza Kitchen, along with Laila. She's a writer, researcher, translator, educator, and social activist. She holds a BA in literature from Harvard University and has conducted advanced graduate studies in social anthropology and Mediterranean studies at the Universidad Autónoma de Madrid. Next, we have Brit Reed. Brit is a chef and a Choctaw member currently living in Coast Salish Reservation in Washington State. She has been a pioneer in the food sovereignty as a tribal sovereignty movement in the United States. Chef Brit is a member of the I Collective, which stands for 4 principles of indigenous, inspired, innovative, and independent. And she is all those things. She's a graduate of the Seattle Culinary Academy. Finally, John Wilson is the director of Rogue and Vigor, which provides farm consulting services to various impactful projects along the U.S. East Coast. Before that, he served as Director of Agriculture at Snug Harbor Cultural Center and Botanical Garden in Staten Island, New York. He's a multiracial farmer rooted in abolition, and he creates farms that connect with traditions and practices of our ancestors while building a future where many worlds fit. So if this were a real in-person event, we would all be giving a rousing round of applause. But I'm sure that everyone is just as excited I am to hear from our speakers. So this is going to be very conversational and informal, and please save your questions and comments for later on. I'd like to open with an opening question for each of our speakers, which is, can you tell us your personal and political journey that brought you to seeing food and food sovereignty as a central part of your work? And I'd like to start with Laila.
Yeah, sorry that you might hear my 3-year-old in the background. So I'll try my best to speak over her. Mm-hmm. But if it's too distracting, I might have to defer to the next person. So that's a question we get asked a lot, and I don't think I have a super clear answer, but I think most people don't. It's not like at least for me, speaking as a Palestinian who grew up in different parts of diaspora, initially in in the Gulf states, and then going back occasionally in the summers to Palestine, it was really a feeling of kind of this disconnection from my own sort of history and peoples and land that led me to want to further explore. And one of the, I think I found the most tangible ways to do so, and effective, sensual ways to do so, was through food. It was something that, I like to say was real and tangible. I could feel it, I could touch it, I could smell it. And it was kind of like this, key to opening up all sorts of doors and pathways, foodways, if you will, to histories and peoples and lands that I felt completely divorced from and alien to. And so that was sort of the initial, I don't want to spend too much time because I know we have a large list of panelists, but that was my initial kind of foray into that world. And it really did help me, and we'll talk more about how, at the heart and the root of sort of settler colonialism is control. And this sort of seems to be the theme. We'll mention it over and over: control over land and resources and people. And sort of forcibly disconnecting them from those land and resources. And so for me, one way to be able to reconnect and reestablish those connections was initially through food. And it was not something that necessarily came natural in my family. They were both parents were busy and working professionals, et cetera, like many Palestinians in the 70s and 80s. And so it was something that I had to kind of actively work and study and explore. And a lot of this information was not recorded, right? It was mainly sort of oral, transmitted in that way. And when the Palestinian nation got sort of scattered, that knowledge went in all sorts of places, and so that's kind of how it started for me.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. And Maggie? Oh, you're muted.
Sorry. Like Laila, I don't have a sort of obvious or packageable answer thinking about this. In my case, as a sort of multi-background hybrid white person with a highly sort of uprooted and mobile family in the United States growing up, I've always been really interested in how we make place and how we question what we inherit as place and the places we can make. And I felt like the places I inherited were not acceptable to me in a lot of different ways. And so I think I spent my first few decades really traveling around a lot, living and working in very different places. And I think spending a lot of time listening and trying to understand how place gets made, how places are made meaningful by the people that inhabit them, and the integrity of place, kind of, and never feeling like I understood. Like, I've always been a frustrated farmer. I've always wished I could farm, but I didn't feel like there was a piece of a place to go. Like, there's no place to go back to that would be that has a legitimacy, a validity that would make sense. And so I feel like I floated around for a very long time trying to just listen to how that works. And one of the things that along the way I discovered about myself and about others was that, like, the best stories happen in the kitchens. And so always, as you sort of try to humbly approach places and people and learn about, I'm not sure how to live. How do you live? Like, let's see if you can help me figure out an okay way to live. And the best stories happen in the kitchen, and the real where meaning gets constructed happens in the kitchen, and also on farms, because of the sort of total materiality and the commitment to, like, perpetuating life that you find in those two places. So I guess I've always been really attracted to those two places. And then as this journey unfolds, I mean, I've spent a lot of time doing community building in different places where, food and cooking proves like a real glue for sticking people together and for building a sense of community, where maybe community isn't an obvious or a natural or a given thing, like it has to get made. And also as a feminist, the daily practical immediate materiality of food and cooking and agriculture are really compelling to me. And as studying and researching and this and that, one gets tired of sort of more abstract and theoretical approaches to, like, how to think about politics, and more attracted with time to really material, concrete alternatives of, like, how can you make the soil alive? How can we foster life in place? Anyway, so I could go on on this, but I'm now living in a rural area in Spain, and sort of trying to, on the one hand, continue documenting how food and how food and how farmers make place work in meaningful ways, and at the same time trying to do it myself.
Thank you, Maggie. Brit, should we go on to you about your personal and political journey towards food sovereignty?
Sure. Laila sa Hachafia, Brit Reed, Choctaw Indian, Machahoponisia, Laila Washington Adali. Just opening up with my introduction in my language, as we're always taught to do. And so just going on from there, my journey also hasn't been a very straightforward one, as our other panelists have discussed in their own journeys. I was adopted out as a child, and just to give context for that, for Native American people, in order to assimilate us back in the 1800s, they began taking children from families and from their tribes and putting them into boarding schools as a means to ensure that they would kill the Indian and save the men. And then in the decided to move from boarding schools and transition into adoption. And so now we have many children who are being adopted out as a means to separate them from their tribal communities and to assimilate them. And so that's kind of my background, but I was very fortunate to grow up in a family where, even though it wasn't Native, they were very supportive of cooking and always had me and my brother in the kitchen and, like, trying out different over time, how being together and sitting down at a table and cooking and eating can really forge very strong relationships. and lead towards like a healthy environment. And so when I was in college and was able to move away, I began to reconnect with tribal communities and also with specifically Choctaw communities. And it was by getting involved in ceremony where I met my second set of adopted parents, my spiritually adopted parents, that they began to talk to me about traditional foods and the importance of them, and both not only like being able to feed you in a healthy kind of way, but also to feed your soul, both like culturally and spiritually. And so I carried that through into my studies, going to the Evergreen State College. Adoption and the Indian Child Welfare Act, and then also in food studies. And I continued that on into my master's program there, and then also continued the study in food sovereignty, where at the time there was not as much information gathered in one place that talked about what was going on in Indian country in regards to food, in regards to traditional food, or like what different tribes are doing. And so as an answer to an assignment that I had in a food policy class, I wrote an article, and I also started a group called Food Sovereignty is Tribal Sovereignty, and which comes from a talk from Valerie Seagrass in her TED Talk that you can look up. It's really great. And through many different hands, including Buffy Turner, they began to gather more and more Native people. Now we're up to over 7,000 people that are all in tribal nations. And that propelled me to meet other people like Sean Sherman and Carlos Baca and Brian Yazzie, Christina Stanley, and a number of other Native chefs who are very involved with cooking pre-colonial foods. And through being inspired by them and also recognizing that I couldn't just study these things, like that's not very helpful on the ground to many people. And so I decided to go to culinary school as an answer of like needing to get my hands dirty to be able to help out the community. And so I went to culinary school and was very honored to be asked by Brian Yazzie and Carlos Baca to join the I Collective, which is to talk about a little bit in the introduction, but it's a collective of Indigenous chefs, cooks, knowledge keepers, seed keepers, activists, and artists who specifically, we do like pop-ups and things like that, but specifically talk about pre-colonial foods and food sovereignty and what that means for our communities. And I've also been honored to be able to go on to live here at Tulalip, which is my partner's reservation, and I work for the diabetes program. And that's one way that I'm able to incorporate working directly with the community to use healthy foods and traditional foods to be able to combat epidemic levels of diabetes and other chronic diseases that we experience. So that's how I got involved in all that.
Wonderful. Thank you. And on to you, Jonathan.
Thanks for everyone for sharing so much. Really amazing just to think about all the paths that took us here. I essentially have the same thing to share. There wasn't a moment or a specific marker in time, but so much I think about, for me, growing food and reclaiming land has been about reclaiming identity that's been stolen from all of us. I do want to honor that I'm actually sitting on Quinnipiac land right now on the Atlantic coast of Connecticut, and I'm farming on Esopus and Muncie land, which are tribes from the Lenape Nation in New York. My grandmother is Black and Native American, and both cultures have such a rich history of stewardship of the land that I think has been erased from our lexicon and just from our knowledge. And I think so much is also, I think, as far as, you know, food is so nourishing, growing food is so transformative. I think so much of what we do also is to heal, you know, from the trauma of hundreds and hundreds, if not thousands of years of different forms of oppression and colonization that have led us to this moment right now. So again, I'm just thankful for this time that we're able to have to share, to move forward collectively and hopefully create this space for all of us to be able to allow others to empower themselves through food and land.
Thank you, Jonathan. And as you can see from the expansive introductions, we've already uncovered some pretty big and important concepts. And back to you, Laila, you know, just having that connection from Gaza, you know, where especially in the COVID era, people are living in uninhabitable conditions, suffering from lack of drinking water, unemployment, poverty, all kind of shooting up. So can you talk about why food sovereignty, especially now, is so compelling in Gaza, and also link that to your idea of how settler colonialism has attempted to rewrite people's relationship with the land and food. So just centering Gaza in this conversation.
That's a tough question. I just wanted also to say, sorry, I was really distracted earlier because my 3-year-old was like wailing bloody murder at the door outside the office. And I was trying not to be nervous, but anyway, I wanted to say that I too am coming to you from here, where I'm living, my home in Clarksville, Maryland, which is the ancestral home of the Piscataway peoples, and I pay my respect to elders past and present, and acknowledge that I here am a visitor. So apologies for not mentioning that earlier. But back to your question, I did want to also comment on one thing that Maggie said, and maybe it's more of a question. When you're talking about the search for a place, it kind of made me think, can we, and this is something we can all mull over, can we consider food a place? I'm just going to kind of put that out there, but it kind of made me think, you know, as you were talking about the search for place and the meaning for place. But back to the question about food sovereignty. So, you know, I never obviously formally studied any of this stuff, but my interest in it came much later. And so all the words and the technicalities are pretty new to me, but in my ongoing exploration and you know, education on the topic, as a Palestinian who lived for a long time in diaspora and tries to go back frequently, is that, you know, what makes Gaza, you know, it has the unfortunate, you know, position to be such, you know, I'm trying to think of the best way to explain why food so for a long time, Palestinians in Gaza have sort of been living under a situation of sort of parallel governance, right? So on one hand, you have the overarching settler colonial rule of the Israelis, right? Even after they sort of formally disengaged from within Gaza in 2005, they retained ultimate control over Gaza's borders, its sea space, its economy, its taxation, population registry, and so on and so forth. And I think we need to establish that in order, you know, to have any kind of conversation about food sovereignty is to be able to understand that, you know, ultimately, I mentioned this before, but settler colonialism are rooted in control over land and people. And, you know, can you have food sovereignty without, can you even speak of it? Can you speak of any kind of sovereignty without having access to those things and resources and control, you know? I don't know. But so the situation in Gaza has been that you have this overarching Israeli rule, right? And then you have this parallel governance of the local authorities with their nominal power, nominal civil authority. And then you have a whole parallel structure of non-governmental organizations, local ones, foreign ones, big international ones like the, you know, World Food Program and whatnot, FAO, and so on and so forth. And the model that they use, as we know, tends to be the one of food security rather than food sovereignty and food justice. And so, you know, as, you know, Chung-Wha mentioned in the introduction, this then presents the problem of, you know, the focus, you know, and you mentioned Raj Patel as well, is on just having access to, you know, food, and food becoming sort of just numbers and calories and things like that. And ultimately that leading to just being able to provide an X number of calories to a population that has been under, you know, a decades long, you know, siege and blockade and whatever, to make sure that their nutritional needs in front of the international community are met. And that translates then into just these calories coming from things, you know, And it's this big system, right? These imported, white products of, flour and sugar and on and on and on. That's over the years has slowly really stripped, I would say, the population and pushed them further and further away from their, traditional diet. And so that for me is why I think, in short, food sovereignty, then where that comes in and why I think it should become more central. And I'm seeing a shift towards that, more important, and the conversation should be centered in that way, rather than a talk of just food security and food insecurity and what can we provide to make sure the population is fed, beginning to talk about, where is this food coming from, under what conditions, can people farm, can they access their farms, can they grow their own food, do they have control over any of the, any of these spaces, back to that word. And they don't, and obviously in Gaza is a very extreme example of this, and it even differs than neighboring West Bank, right? Both under Israeli rule and Palestinian civil authority, in the sense that they don't have as much access. Obviously water is a big issue in both places, but in Gaza, it's like a microcosm of a much larger problem. It's like everything is so intense. If you wanna access the farms on the border, you do so at your own peril. Half of the farmland is along Gaza's borders, where you're always risk, it's considered an Israeli buffer zone, so you always risk being shot. Much of that land was cleared over the past decade, by Israeli bulldozers and so on. And so farmers have had to plant not once, but twice, but 3 times. So I don't know, how can we talk about food sovereignty in such a intense situation, and and I mean, just one statistic that really demonstrates how insane and maddening this all is that, and I think in 2000 and in the early 2000s, something like 45% of Palestinians were in the agricultural sector, either farming, fishing, etc. And by 2017, that had gone down to something like 14%. Just by the sheer forces at work to prevent them, be it clearing the land, be it the placing of checkpoints and things to make it more difficult and buffer zones to reach the land, be it control over resources like water, be it control over access routes for imports and exports like the borders. So this is the thing I'm asking, and I constantly want to learn. Yet I see on a small scale there is a move towards, Maggie mentioned about doing something material and something more meaningful, and I'm seeing slowly a shift away from just sort of the politics of it that can be very frustrating and almost like futile in a way, and rather something more material and concrete, like what can farmers do on a small scale to establish some semblance of control over their individual, even if not on a macro level, on their individual small foodways, and I think that's what we're starting to see happen. And even if it's not happening on a mass scale, that's where I think the conversation should shift and where efforts should be.
Mm-hmm. And we'll come back to you to ask for some real examples, some of whom you outline in your book, where food is used as a source of resilience, creativity, building community. So
Exactly.
Stay tuned. So we'll come back to you with that. Maggie, the other thing you've pointed out about the process of writing this book was to notice that you described in this book the history as written in the feminine, and the women who cook as the ones who are building spaces for care and holding up the community. So can you talk, as a feminist, can you talk about that aspect of food sovereignty?
Okay. I have a number of things to say about that. On the one hand, I think like I said before, food and cooking is a way, or talking about food and cooking, like telling a story from the perspective of food as opposed to starting from some other place, because really, like you pull on the string and everything's connected always. No, it's all a system. But if you choose to pull on the string of food and sort of follow that where it leads you in terms of how the politics and the economy and the land distribution and all of these other things work, you can tell that through food, which is what we were trying to do in the Gaza Kitchen. But it's a point of departure that's really based in the material, in the daily, in the gestures and practices and rituals of the everyday. And in some ways, especially in as hotly contested historical space as Palestine, in some ways that allows you to tell the story in a really different way, that the story tends to get told in sort of big words of the national struggle. This is true in Palestine, but this, we could apply this almost to anywhere, that history, the cliche, gets written by the victors and also gets written by those that are dealing with diplomatic accords, political agreements, etc. And so there's sort of history happening at that level, but then there's a history also operating at another level in which the rhythm is different, the dynamic is different, the actors and the protagonists are different. And to tell the history of a people and of a place sort of through its kitchens is to accept a really different rhythm of time and political change and transformation, and borders get changed in a minute when an accord gets signed, especially in all of the colonized lands of the world. But food has a different duration. It has a different, it has a different kind of friction or inertia. I don't know, it changes more slowly. And the habits of the gestures and the tastes transform at a different rhythm. And that for us was really, really, and it doesn't appear in the written histories. It's an oral history. It's transmitted from generation to generation, almost exclusively between women. And it's a history of sustaining daily life that kind of gives the lie to a lot of these like big narratives and offers a different way of accessing things. So I think for us, doing the research on this book was tremendously interesting, because you pull on those threads of how people make food, talk about food, think about food, the family stories around food, and it reveals a sort of whole other story that more official and generally masculine narratives don't. So that's one part. But then I always sort of insist that, like, when we talk about feminism, like on the one hand, it's talking about like stuff that happens to women, but on the other hand, it's a whole sort of way of looking. It's a whole genealogy, it's a whole way of reading the world, right? And if we talk about food sovereignty, like it's a feminist issue because it happens to women. If we look at the like things that happen to women category, it's, in those places where there is a modicum of food sovereignty, it's largely upheld by women. Like 80% of the world's food produced by peasant communities on their own land is being produced by women. So it is a hugely sort of women-impelled reality. And in those places where food sovereignty is lost, diminished, colonized, dispossessed, hugely those that suffer the consequences of that are women. Everyone, but women often at the very sort of front line of who bears the brunt of that. That's a whole other story. We can go into that. But then also looking at feminism as a way of looking and a way of sort of reading reality. For me, it's really important to look at food sovereignty also from the lens of putting care in the center, as sort of feminist economy asks us to do. No, that if we understand the world kind of through the lens of like there's extractivism, and then there are the bodies and the lands and the life that it devours or it predates. That's kind of a key, I think, or that helps us understand a lot of and put in common a lot of these colonized experiences that and feminism kind of turns that logic. Well, a friend of mine, a feminist economist, Amaya Perez Orozco, always says, like, for capital, the maxim is profit accumulation, and life in all of its facets and all of its ways is a means to that end, right? And feminism or feminist economics proposes turning that entirely on its head and saying, okay, life is in the center. What would the world look like? What would economic systems look like? How would we organize things if we put life and the perpetuation of life in all of its cultures and species, and from the microbiotic to the cultural at the center, and the sort of perpetuation of life at the center, what would configure itself around that as an economic system, just kind of as a thought exercise. And I think food sovereignty is very much about that. And I think the thinking about food sovereignty is very much, another kind of focused way of asking that same question. So having gone all over the place, those are a few answers.
No, but if our conversation leads to feminist economy, I think that's a good path. I also wanted to circle back to Brit, and both if you feel any parallels between the Palestinian story and the indigenous story, and just making those connections. When you say food sovereignty is tribal sovereignty.
Yeah, I mean, and I want to thank the panelists who've spoken already. Like, I feel like I have so many things I want to say. Yeah, I think much like Palestine, when we say sovereignty for Native nations, we mean sovereignty. A treaty is something that is an agreement or a contract between two governmental entities that are understood to be actual nations. It's not just that the United States government came through and made these agreements with these ethnic groups. These tribes have specific sovereignty that is specific to each tribe. And so when we talk about tribal sovereignty for Native nations, that plays into the actual governmental structure and the right of a people to rule themselves. And I think the thing about and they take over your land and all those things is that there's also, especially here in the United States, and I'm sure this might be the same also for Palestine, is that the story is constantly rewritten and rewritten and rewritten and retold and retold and retold to glorify those that have come here and settled here, which is really just a polite way of saying invaded. And continue to stay. And I mean, we just had an example of that just yesterday of one of those stories that's retold over and over and over again to make this nice history that's not so nice. But Valerie Seagrass talks about, for tribes, whenever our food is so important to us, it's not just something that we put into our body, but they're our relatives. And that when we made these treaties, we were thinking of our relatives and wanting to make sure that they were protected when we were making these agreements. And so yeah, so for us, it's much more than just the food that we put in our bodies. One of the things I think about oftentimes too, in relation between Palestine and Native peoples, is that despite these treaties that were made, these agreements, these contracts, if you will, to be able to have access to usual and accustomed land. So not just the places where the various tribes would put on their reservations, which historically were prisoner of war camps, but that they would have access to all of their territory, not just those plots of lands, and that they'd be able to go out and hunt and fish and gather and and also grow food. My tribe specifically was a huge agricultural nation, and we're actually considered the bread. And what we saw instead was, of course, we all know that these treaties were not upheld on the United States end, and that for tribal people could get shot trying to leave these boundaries of these prisoner of war camps that are what we call reservations now. And even up until the 1970s, here specifically where I'm at in the Northwest, people like fishing is a huge part of the culture. It's not just the way that, again, that they feed themselves, but it's also a really spiritual part of it as well. And so eating things like salmon, the relationship to the salmon and those other sea creatures that they would eat is really important. And so they would go off, they'd have to go sneak out at night and go fish, and then use lines to drag the fish through through the plants and stuff to make it look like they weren't fishing, or they'd have to hide it and come back. And and people that didn't, like, they could get put in prison, put in jail. There's a person named Billy Frank Jr. who was literally put in jail over 50 times for just trying to fish and fighting for the right to fish. And so, like, we see these parallels even up into the 70s and also to today. There's Algonquin people who are still fighting for the right to hunt moose right now. There is a huge struggle up in Nova Scotia as well with the Micmac, with lobster access to food, and see people face still having to, like, possibly go to jail just to access their food and to uphold these treaties and those relationships to those relatives that they have. So that's some of the things that I think about when I think about some of the similarities between Native nations here and also what happens over in Palestine.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And it's a very powerful image of the prisoner of war camp, and then Gaza being seen as a open air prison, which leads to one of the other connections that we really wanted to make was around abolition. And this question's for you, Jonathan. You talk about being a farmer rooted in abolition. Can you say more about what it means to farm with an abolitionist approach, including sharing some examples, local examples that you've been involved in? You're muted now, so I have to.
Thank you. Sure, thank you. Yeah, I would say that the link between abolitionist farming and food sovereignty is inextricable, right? You know, just to step back, food advocacy, right? It sets up a really fragile system that creates a shadow state, but leaves millions of people food insecure, right? It's not effective. It doesn't actually execute its purpose. Food sovereignty looks at how do we create autonomy and self-determination against, right, that colonial landscape and that extractive landscape that we've dealt with in this on Turtle Island, right, for almost half a millennia. So abolition in farming, I would say specifically, is rooted in creating spaces where people can choose to heal themselves, where people can choose to empower themselves, where myself, I just to give context, I think that all of us, but I could cite maybe thousands of examples of my own, trauma of trying to farm under capitalism and imperialism, and how much we internalize that, and then how much we actually then, we put that back out into the universe. So I think abolitionist farming is really challenging that. It's challenging the concept that settler colonial practices, whether in Palestine, whether on Turtle Island, are the foundation that we need to work back from, right? That all land is stolen, that there isn't a dynamic that we can reform or permutate, to somehow look through through some optics or lens like justice, right? Abolition seeks to get to the root, right? To tear it out from the root, which means that it's really a philosophy and a practice that we need to embody versus like an end road. The same way in abolition, I think folks always ask, what do you do with the really bad people, right? When someone asks, if you're a prison abolitionist, what do you do with the really bad people? It's about looking at the conditions that created the harm, right? That created the situations for all of these folks to be labeled bad people, right? That's abolition. The same way in agriculture, it's not necessarily figuring out how do we, reshape the landscape. It's actually saying, no, how do we take back stolen land? And once we get to that point, right, we're looking at what are the regenerative practices that indigenous folks use, et cetera, right? So I think abolitionist farming seeks to look at that philosophy and practice foundationally into how we do all of our work. And I definitely, I think I just read a really great book by Dr. Robert Spencer called The Revolution Has Come, about leadership in the Black Panther Party. And just like all of the, I think the foundation and threads that I've heard right now, the one thing, the link that has kept the struggle intact, and then I think has us now pivoting to a place of acknowledging the importance of healing, and the importance of self-care. That comes from a long, tradition of women always holding up this movement, always being present, maybe not visible by the patriarchy, but clearly, the foundation that's allowed us to be able to move in this direction where we're having this self-reflective moment,
Yeah, you're reminding me of a quote by Angela Davis, who talks about abolition feminism as a methodology, not just an idea. And maybe we can pivot to some of those examples of regenerative practices. When we're prepping for this call, Jonathan, you talked about woke foods, Cafe Forsaken, your work with Department of Probation. What are some of the examples that kind of embody all the values that you talked about?
So I can speak to those. So woke foods and Cafe Forsaken is really amazing. I just kind of learned about it. One of the folks that works with it was a farmer that I farmed with for a season and a half, and they came about essentially as a necessity of care and creating access to nutrient-dense food during the pandemic. They've done some really amazing work in partnering with community gardens, working with, I think, large retailers to take seconds and donations. And I know that they're able to serve thousands of meals over the course of the pandemic at no cost, and in a real clear example of mutual aid within the community. And I think it's examples like that, again, that I think that are moving away from extractive capital-based farming, which I'm a survivor of myself, into methodologies, again, of creating, foundations where we are focusing on self-care, healing, and not just regenerative agriculture and farming, but how does that relate to, like you were saying, if food is a space, right? And if we're trying to hold this place, what does that look like to hold up, right, our community, our people, our comrades? And that's, I think, the, kind of the nuance, right, of abolition is how do you actually be an abolitionist sometimes in spaces where abolition is not welcome. And then, so I worked at a cultural institution for 7 years, and I think that's what I tried to do. I tried to figure out how can we create systems of abolition in a space and place where it's quote unquote is not supposed to be. So historically, farming in the Northeast, the appearance of it is very white. The resources are very white. Who owns the majority of the land is very white. Urban agriculture is actually, I think, much more diverse. But in New York City, where I got my start, I think gentrification and the optics of class, somehow made it appear that urban agriculture wasn't actually a mixed cultural amorphous, group of folks. And I think that was a detriment to how folks receive funding, and how I think folks were engaging urban agriculture. This is like maybe late 90s, early 2000s. So I think what I tried to figure out how to do is, okay, how can we put abolitionist policies or abolitionist practices into a space like that? So I ended up partnering with Department of Probation. Even though I recognize working with them, who, I think have many contradictions and many problems, we were able to hire 4 former probation participants in a youth program. All of them were able to receive, more, I would say more than a living wage. And some actually ended up working full-time with benefits, even vacation days, as young people coming out of probation. So I think that example, even though it has tendencies of reform within it because we're working within a large cultural institution, it's, again, creating space for folks to be able to empower themselves in a space where historically, young people of color on probation are not welcome in cultural institutions and are not necessarily present in agriculture. So I think it is, again, cracking open that space, right, foundationally, and figuring out how to challenge those contradictions by making space for folks who traditionally are not present in that space.
And I want to go back to you, Laila and Maggie, about examples that you've seen in Gaza, despite the occupation, despite the portrayal of Palestinians as victims, kind of the hope and joy and energy and creativity you saw, witnessed, that you captured in your book so well. What are some of those examples?
Yeah, I'll speak a bit and then I'll hand it over to Maggie. I did want to say that, you know, Brit, as you were speaking, I kept thinking of parallels in the Palestinian context to, you know, specifically to the, you know, penalization by Israeli authorities of Palestinians who forage for, you know, indigenous ingredients like, you know, za'atar, or there's a certain kind of thistle in the north of Palestine that's very seasonal and popular, and a couple of other things. There's really hefty fines if, you know, Palestinians are caught foraging for these things, which they do anyway, obviously, but in a very clandestine way, like in the cover of night and so on and so forth. And it's been documented. And then in the case of Gaza, specifically with the fishing, that was the biggest parallel that I found. You know, as you may or may not be aware, there's a fluctuating naval blockade that restricts fishermen's access, you know, anywhere from, at its lowest point, 4 nautical miles up to 12 nautical miles, which isn't a whole lot. And if you, you know, go beyond that line, you get shot or, you know, detained or whatever. So I thought that was really interesting. You know, and again, you control a nation through control of its food and resources. This is kind of what we keep going back to. In terms of sort of positive examples, you know, again, with the focus being on sort of like what I really liked what Maggie was saying about that, that food has a different duration or timeline. I mean, we saw so many when we were there, and I've gone subsequent to that visit when we went together many times, as recent as exactly 1 year ago. And, you know, I'm constantly, it's funny, even though I'm Palestinian, you know, we all fall victim to this mentality of like, you know, oh, you know, poor Palestinians, poor Gaza, whatever. And every time I go, I feel like I keep learning so much from my own people about, you know, what it means to be eternally like hopeful and optimistic and endure, you know, and not succumb to, you know, the script that's being, you know, handed out or forced down your throat or whatever. But, you know, when I'll just talk about my most recent experience last year, which is, you know, I mean, I went to so many examples of small, you know, specifically relating to farming, farms where, you know, I mean, maybe I'll talk about the organic farm that Maggie and I visited. This is a guy that is so passionate about, you know, one of the main problems, let me just preface it really quickly, I know that we don't have much time, that Palestinians face specifically in Gaza, but also in the West Bank, is the dumping of sort of rejected produce that is from the Israeli export market to Europe. And I think Israel ranks as one of the highest nations in terms of the pesticide use on its products. And if it doesn't meet the European whatever standards, then they're dumped on the Palestinian market at sort of exorbitant prices that we're forced to pay, and so on and so forth. And so there was a small little movement to attempt to counter this. And one of the farmers that we met had started with some, you know, NGO funding, a small organic farm, in as much as that it is possible, not in a sort of like, you know, imported Western sense, but you know, truly, you know, just in a more what made sense and was organic, you know, literally and figuratively, right? And we got back in touch with him like a few weeks ago, and we were happy to see that he was still going strong at it. But what we really loved is that, you know, he was so peaceful and at peace and so happy in what he was doing and genuinely believed in this mission. And it was replicated, I think, in northern Gaza and a few other places, and had so many clients who were, you know, local women and others that had gotten cancers and various other ailments that they suspect came from this produce they were eating and from depleted uranium from the bombed out buildings and whatnot. But it was just the harmony in that place was incredible, from the beneficial insects he was talking about to, you know, the, I think he was doing some aquaponic farming, right, Maggie? And so on. And, you know, to you know, female-led households in southern Gaza, northern Gaza, where, you know, the women had divvied up the land, you know, And it was almost a completely sustainable model, which, you know, might seem like, oh, that's not a big deal. But in a place like Gaza, it's a huge deal that one can actually accomplish such a feat on a very small amount of land, which most people don't even have access to their own personal plots anymore in Gaza. You know, where, again, this just exuberant, joyful household where everything was being done seasonally and locally, from, you know, the cows to the chickens to harvesting the chili peppers, to multiple women's cooperatives, where, you know, local produce was being processed and made, from like date paste to, you know, I talked about the chili peppers and so on and so forth. But just example of people actually doing, you know what I mean? Doing and creating and trying to, you know, keep that energy alive and sustain in whatever way they know how, in whatever, you know, is accessible and available to them. And Maggie, maybe you want to add a little bit.
You have to unmute yourself, and just briefly, because I know we want to go to audience questions in a minute.
I love picking up where Laila left off with this one individual that we were especially impressed by, and his organic farm. The image sticks in my mind of this man trying to do a kind of sort of biodynamic organic farming that relies hugely upon, you know, the wealth of the soil and beneficial insects, and in a place that, you know, as long as you're only looking sort of immediately on his very tiny plot of land, I mean, maybe 5 acres at the very most, or 3, on this small plot of land, this incredibly vital territory, and you raise your gaze up and all around is just absolute devastation. And because of the systematic spraying of herbicides in the border area, because of the demolition, because, as Laila mentioned, of the repeated bombings and all of the contaminants that come with them, like the degree of destruction all around, and this insistence on, like, I'm not going to despair by looking around. I'm just going to focus on this one little thing that is the one thing that I can do, and I'm going to make a safe haven for those insects and for the food and for all the people that come there, but on that tiny terrain. And I think we both found that tremendously moving as kind of a lesson to all of us in these times, no, to cultivate this little place and make it a place of richness, no, and that kind of dynamic of, like, I will just focus on what I can control and make it a place of richness and beauty and joy and wealth, and that same spirit repeated in almost every household we set foot in, of people that just sort of refusing to despair by looking at the apparently totally insuperable odds against them and just focusing on making those little spaces and refuges, kind of, and that was really moving.
And I want to just also call out a group in Palestine called Union of Agricultural Work Committees, who support local residents and farmers with their individual farms, as well as doing bigger land reclamation projects, saving heirloom seeds with hundreds of seeds that would have been otherwise lost, and supporting farmers with kind of the seeds and tools aspect of their work, as well as kind of the broader organizing work as well. I'm going to circle back to Brit, and it wouldn't be right not to ask a chef about maybe a couple of your favorite dishes and how they help you connect with your ancestors, your culture.
For myself, I usually, I'm very like context specific, right? And so for me, even though there's like plenty of Native American cuisines out there, because there's over 566 federally recognized tribes, and then there's even more that aren't recognized in Canada and Mexico. For me, I specifically look at Choctaw because I'm Choctaw, as well as Lakota because I'm adopted. I have Honka parents. And then I also am here, obviously, in Coast Salish territory. So those are the 3 cuisines that I specifically look at to cook in context of those specific communities. as a way to kind of like start learning about my own people's food was a dish called tanchi labona. Tanchi labona is one that is also cooked by the Chickasaw, who are like our cousins. They call it pashofa. Traditionally, this dish would have been made with corn and hominy, so corn that's gone through a nixtamalization process, as well as sometimes hickory nuts and like some sort of game meat. So either like deer, rabbit, I guess if like they really had to like squirrel, alligator, whatever people had on hand, because you know back in the day you couldn't really be as picky as we can be now. But today, like I guess like one thing maybe Maggie will be interested in knowing is like during colonization, of course, like the Spaniards came over to our area. So Hernando de Soto was the first conquistador that came through our area, and they left all these pigs, which if you're familiar with like Spanish cuisine, I'm forgetting the exact name of it, but like the Himon Iberico is like really big. It's like, I can't tell you how expensive just a leg off of that pig would be. But they left a bunch of those pigs in our territory in the South. And so that's like why like you see like the Razorbacks and all that. It's partly because of the Spaniards leaving those pigs in our area. And for us, like we saw them as kind of dirty for a long time until the French fur trade completely wiped out our deer population in Choctaw territory. And so that moved the dish from having deer meat in it into pork. And so now if you go to like Oklahoma or Mississippi, if you get tanchi labona, you'll get like corn and hominy and pork in the dish, and it's really delicious. And that breed of pig also developed into the breed of pig called the Choctaw pig or hog as well. So I really love that dish, and I also really love banaha. Like a tamale. I'm convinced that despite the erasure that settler colonialism has done, when you start to learn about the traditional foods in all the different areas of the Americas, you can start to see that prehistory that happened. So of course we see like tamales being around like in what we call now Mexico, and there's several different kinds in like Oaxaca area. But throughout the Southwest, like they have like a kneel down bread in Navajo Nation that's kind of like a tamale. And then you go over to the Southeast where we're at, we have banaha, which is like still the same kind of like cornmeal that's like wrapped in a husk and then boiled, and you eat kind of like tamale. And we also put beans in it to make a complete protein. And then you go all the way up into like Mohawk like territory and up into Canada, where they have different kinds of a similar dish too. So I really like the Choctaw version of it the best, because that's my bias. Choctaw. But yeah, I think it's really interesting to look at that food history and see what might be there to tell us about the time before colonialism happened.
And you're making us kind of salivate. I wanted to ask the audience if you have any questions or have thoughts you want to share in the chat box, please do so. I also want to encourage, or if any of the panelists, if you have questions for each other or react to comments that's been said before, I'm just really appreciating the layers of connections that we're making between what might be considered very different contexts, New York, Palestine, Choctaw, your Salish reservation, but we're making those connections so poignantly.
I wanted to like, if I could interject.
Yes.
I think one of the things, like when you were talking, Laila, earlier about like if food could be place, there's a podcast called the Toasted Sister Podcast. It's really great, totally recommend it. But they just did a Thanksgiving episode. And one of the things that really stood out to me that they talked about is this woman was talking about, you know, she's Mashpee not because of just being like a, you know, like that's her tribe, but she's Mashpee because she eats the food from that land. She, you know, she eats the plants. They're also going to her. And so in that way, she's also the land. And so I thought that was really interesting. I think as like for myself, and I'm sure like maybe y'all have thoughts about this too, like being both Choctaw, I feel like I'm like like the double diaspora of that, because of course like we were put on the Trail of Tears out of what's now Mississippi into Oklahoma, And then now I'm like in the Pacific Northwest, but I'm also Black as well. And so I've got like the couple of diasporas going on there. And so for my, like me, I'm always wondering like, when I don't live in that place, like how do I put that? Like, I know like for me, like I always look for like, what are similar foods I can go out and gather that are Choctaw.
How can you recreate it? Or
yeah. But it's like, if you're also like if she's Mashpee because she's also eating the food from there, like how does that affect us in the diaspora where we may not have access to the plants and like the animals and stuff that are from that to be able to take that in? So I'll leave that.
Yeah, that's a great question. That's something that sometimes bothers me a lot, or I kind of like, obsess about, is this whole aspect. I always say there's a lot of other people that have the luxury of being able to sort of visit their ancestral lands, or, in one way or another, sort of in a physical way. And we're still prevented from doing that, or even if we are, we're restricted, even if we aren't, rather, we're restricted greatly. And we always have to kind of think twice about, because our documents will only allow us to certain territories, but not others. And we might risk losing the documents if we go here or there. In my husband's case, he's never been to Palestine at all. He grew up in a refugee camp in Lebanon. And yet, so again, we're always asking this question of what does it mean, to be a Palestinian? And if you've never even been there, or if you can no longer go there or whatever, so that's where food plays a very important role for me. And I'm constantly thinking, how can I honor like his, ancestral homes and lands, and teach that to the kids and help them understand, where they're living. His grandparents were, forced out of their homes during the Nakba, during the 1948 Palestinian, catastrophe and exodus. So it's that same kind of thing that I'm always thinking, without trying to overthink it, just how can I, in a very natural way, help them reconnect to that, and keep those connections alive. And it bothers me a lot because sometimes I feel like it's not central often to conversations that we have, specifically when we're talking about Palestine. It almost is like an afterthought for a lot of people. They really get into the politics of it, or the borders, or this or that and the other. And this is a very central and painful component, I think, for a lot of Palestinians.
I think I love this line of thinking and talking about food as a place and the relationship somehow between food and place. I love the image you're describing, Brit, of like, you are a place because you imbibe it, like it makes your body, and I think that's really important. And here I would throw out maybe a question even to Chung-Wha, thinking about food sovereignty. A lot of the ways of talking about food sovereignty, and a lot of, for example, in Via Campesina, is really based on the idea somehow of indigenous populations on their own land maintaining or defending a food sovereignty that somehow they already have, which is enormously important and terribly under peril in so much of the world. But there's also a gigantic part of the world's population, including, I think, all of us here today, that are diasporas, that are multiple overlapping histories of displacement and diaspora lived in very different ways. But there's no direct or obvious way home. And so there's much to do to honor pasts, and I love what you're describing, Jonathan. I was taking notes of the things you were citing, because I want to read up on the kind of abolitionism that you're describing. But this idea of a practice, like, you can't get there. There's not a moment of arrival in which you've gotten there and it's all fixed. Like, we can't hope for fixed somehow. And this is the case for, I think, all of us in this diasporic world. Like, you can't hope to fix it, but how can we have a methodology by which we, like, asymptotically approach okay? And I think food is one of the practices that works for that. There's also the sort of flip side of that, which is appropriation. And I think we can also talk about that and the sort of pitfalls of food just as a symbol that you can take with you anywhere, and that's not, like, connected directly to the land. But I think it's really interesting to hear all of our different diasporic voices and ways of trying to approach this problem. And I think in some ways it is at odds with a lot of the food sovereignty discourse, which would be a big question I have to the food sovereignty idea, kind of.
Yeah,
Like,
yeah,
who's
it's
the we?
definitely
Who is
not.
the we in food sovereignty?
Yeah,
Right? There's this
yeah.
idea that we can be self-determining, but who is this we? Like the we has to always be created in some ways. There's not an obvious we at this point for a lot of us. For some, there is.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, one of the groups that we support in Honduras, for example, the Lenca people, and many of you might know Berta Cáceres, who was assassinated because of her activism protecting a sacred ancestral river. She talks about, when she introduces herself, she says, my people, Lenca people, are people of the corn. So in addition to food as a place, I think there's for the diaspora especially, there's food as memory also. And in the diaspora communities, it's when the campaigns to erase, the erasure is such a big part of whether it's occupation or colonialism. I think it serves that double purpose of food and memory that becomes such an inextricable part of like your identity. Like that's just who you are. But I don't think it's a very neat definition, and La Via Campesina has more of their external facing message is more of a political message because it was in direct response to the World Trade Organization, WTO, and kind of the globalization. But I think today it's really wonderful to get into the depths of what food means in terms of identity and ancestral connections and kind of individual source of resilience, as well as the political sphere. Let's look at some of the questions here from the audience. One question, Yeah.
Nancy had a great question about what do you want me just to read?
Do you want to? Yeah, Laila, go ahead.
Yeah, she said, I think it's worth understanding there's no status as far as food is concerned. All over the world, food changes and evolves with new products, processes, and populations. Should we not be recognizing that? And how do we bring that to the same table as our respect for deep-seated traditions? Like, I'm supposing she means, how can we sort of address this or discuss this while sort of maintaining or not compromising our respect for deep-seated traditions?
Right, maybe this is a good part to talk about cultural or food-related appropriations, because I think people who try to appropriate indigenous foods kind of justify it, saying, oh, we always kind of copy and it's constantly evolving, right. And it's, you know, maybe that's like one aspect of it that maybe you can clarify. All of you, I know, have had experiences in that.
Right. I mean, there's a lot to say on this. I know we've talked about food, you know, someone after that had a really nice comment and said, building on the metaphor of food as place, it is a way to connect with others. It is personal, sacred, therefore it cannot be conquered. I think a lot of when we're talking about, you know, food appropriation and whatnot, and I think her question is a little bit different. It's like, how can you evolve as, and can you accept, you know, the evolution, the natural evolution of, you know, I'm guessing food or recipes or approaches, while respecting
the
continuity. And I think talking specifically about that versus food appropriation, I think we've talked a lot about sort of the context and the intention behind it. And, you know, rather than it just being kind of a zero-sum type thing or a polarity, it's really like, you know, is it with the intention that you sort of want to erase, eradicate, invisibilize, undermine another culture? Is it being wielded as a kind of weapon, you know? Or is it simply, you know, or do you genuinely understand it's the place and context and the people that it belongs to and to whom it belongs, and then just sort of building on that? So I don't know if you have anything else to add, but that's kind of the framework that I like to think about it. I think it's, it's naive to assume, I think, on anyone's behalf that food and control over food and food waste cannot be wielded as a weapon, and hasn't been, I mean, that's for both if we're discussing specifically for Palestinians and Native American populations, that's definitely been the case.
Others, Brit?
I'd like to jump in, but I also want to give Jonathan a chance to talk before me, since he hasn't been able to talk in a bit. If you had something to add.
I think he's temporarily frozen.
Yeah, put words.
Brit,
Okay.
Brit, go ahead and we'll have him join us.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a difficult conversation, right? I feel like in this globalized world right now, we want to be able to say that it's okay just to take any of these things. I think something that I would like people to recognize as a basis of this conversation is that in terms of I mean, like 60 to 70% of all produce that has become integral parts of cuisines around the world had their origins in the Americas to begin with. Like, how would you have like Russian and Irish food without potatoes? Or like, how would you have kimchi, seafood throughout the world without peppers? And how would you have, like Italian cuisine without tomatoes? So in a sense, we already have worldwide like native food, like fusion, if you will, because these ingredients were already native and just taken out of our continent by colonialization. And there's a reason for that I won't get into. But in terms of right now, it's like we were saying before, like when people have had their food ways taken from them through oppression as a means to conquer them, I think it gets a little dicey, right? Like, so for Native people, for example, like we're now experiencing like this revitalization movement right now in our foods, but a part of that is because people don't have to go to jail as much anymore to be able to access those foods, right? But because we've been given like I have people here on the reservation that are asking me like, how do you cook deer? Where I'm sure that like people that aren't familiar with Native communities would just assume that like it's a native food. Of course you would know. It's like, no, people don't always know. And so a lot of Native people and communities are coming back to these food and gaining the knowledge around them. And so to be able to like of course there's cookbooks out there, but to take the recipes like in those books that are out there and then start a restaurant that has nothing to do with like Native people and gives like nothing back to the community is like so dangerous. Because in a sense also too, these foods are our stories, right? They're our representation, they're who we are. Like I said before, they're also our relatives. And so when you take it without giving anything back to the community or acknowledging who they are, like that's just like a further form of colonization and erasure, and that gets really dangerous. But I will say though that there are plenty who are selling these wonderful products that are traditional foods. Like I can't tell you how amazing like actual maple syrup are, or like maple vinegar or maple sugar. Like, oh my God, that is so good. So thankful that I know like Great Lakes people to be able to use that. There's so many wonderful varieties of like corn and like all these wonderful produce. So like I would definitely say like support Native producers that are producing these foods, because they do, by buying them, you are supporting these communities. You're supporting the ability for people to earn a wage and to be actively involved in these foodways and also to feed their communities, right? And have these relationships with these foods. And like definitely cook with them, just don't take our dishes and then repackage them and then sell it and then make these foods inaccessible for our communities. Because it's definitely something that we've seen with quinoa and like some other foods as well. And so we want to traditional relationships with these foods.
And time flies because I didn't realize I've been remiss in my moderator duties. So we only have 5 more minutes. So while it may seem a little bit abrupt, I want to give everyone maybe 1 minute, just final thoughts. And it could be around, given all these parallels and everything that we've learned today, how can we build together how do we cultivate joy and love in this work going forward? So 1 minute each so that I could also make some announcements. Thank you. And I apologize for not keeping time. Jonathan, would you like to go first since you might freeze again?
Oh, there you go.
Yeah. Jonathan, are you able to go first?
Sure.
Can you hear?
Yeah, absolutely. Sure. Thank you again, everyone. This has really been just amazing and really inspirational. And I think holding space, I think for all the folks who are not able to be with us, I think trying to push the dialogue towards abolition, towards reclamation of stolen land, towards redistribution of wealth. I think towards holding that that long thread of women holding up and holding space for care. I think these are the things that will push us forward. And I'm just thankful. I'm thankful to be part of this time. How brilliant one is showing up. Yeah, it's just really amazing. And I hope that we're able to look at more interconnectedness and understand how our struggles intertwine even more as we move forward.
Thank you. Just 1 minute, Brit, Maggie, and then I'm going to give Laila the final word.
Yeah, so I'd say find joy in learning who the tribes are around you. There's so many wonderful like cultures here in the United States and foodways. Learn about how your local tribe has impacted the regional cuisine in your area, because the base level of all American cuisines in the different regions are what were the traditional cuisines. And learn about the treaties. All of us are beholden to the treaties. It's not just tribal people in the US government or the Canadian government, but it's all of us who live here on these lands. And learn about what the struggles are. Every tribe is going through some sort of fight right now for sovereignty. And so there's tons of local issues around. And I think that Native nations are nothing if not about creating relations. And so I think that when you engage in those and come in a good way, there's a really beautiful path forward and beautiful relationships and a whole new world that you'll be able to experience.
Yeah, Maggie?
I don't know. I don't feel like I'm in much of a place to make prescriptions. It's really an honor to share this space with you guys and discuss this. And I wish we had another couple of hours, because I want to continue listening to you. But to echo Brit, I guess, learn and listen and study and talk to each other and just really pay attention, read together. And I think if one thing has come out of this whole conversation, it's sort of the entwinement of history and the past, sometimes erased or a intentionally forgotten or oppressed past, and the dynamics of the present. And I think we all have so much still to learn about that, and then into the future, because ultimately, like, we're all in this together, like the atmospheric commons, the mineral commons, the soil commons. Like, at the end of the day, like, we're all in this boat together. So we better learn how to listen to each other a little better.
Thank you.
Yeah, and I too want to say it was a great honor, and I wish I could sit here and listen to all of you talk some more. And I was also thinking, man, I wish this could be translated into some kind of like, workshop or course for primary or middle or high school students or something, because that's always something that bothers me as a mother of four, raising four children here, is always like, I feel like I'm always working against the tide, like despite the fact that they are more aware than I would say their peers, but still it's very evident unless you happen to have like a really dedicated teacher that goes out of their way to amend like whatever curriculum they're teaching, it really bothers me that this isn't like a narrative that they're discussing beyond like, yeah, it was something bad that happened, but but really like, no, going out of the way to learn and understand more in an experiential way. And this is something some kind of prescription I wish that we could somehow, implement would be great. And then, on a broader scale, hopefully, eventually, we were hoping to do in conjunction with Mecca in California, the Middle East Children's Alliance, food delegations to Palestine. We were supposed to have started in the summer. I don't know where that is with COVID, but it would be the first like such delegation to bring, interested parties and peoples and chefs and food justice advocates and so forth from the United States to go over there and begin to establish connections and partnerships. And I think that's an important step as well. So hopefully we can make that happen, and maybe even eventually we can work on doing some kind of joint, dinner, even, if it was a virtual one, we'll see. That would be a great thing as well. That's always a great way to have more conversations with different parties.
Thank you so much. All of you have been just amazing. I know it's only the tip of the iceberg of your deep experiences and wisdom, and I hope that we'll be able to learn more from you in the future. Just 1 minute and final announcements, if Amel or Charlotte could share the slide. I want to say that you will have a chance to hear more from Laila and Maggie. All right, let me do this in the right order. So the webinar has been recorded. And so when you check back on the website, there will be the recording that's available for further distribution. You can recommend it to friends and others who might be interested. So please check back. And you will be able to hear in the second webinar, hear more from Laila and Maggie. It's December 12th. More amazing talks about Gaza and the food system. So stay tuned and be sure to put that on your calendars. And then next slide. Great. And plugging financial support, Just World Educational will continue to do these great educational sessions. If your support could help make that happen, that would be great. And Grassroots International, like I mentioned, if you're looking for a place where you can channel your donations to food sovereignty organizations and other human rights organizations in Palestine, including Gaza, feel free to check out our website. So both organizations will continue to make Palestine and food sovereignty a key part of what we do. And lastly, your feedback is really important to us. Please stay on, and as soon as we're done with this webinar, there'll be a short evaluation form to fill out. So if you do that, that'll be enormously helpful. So thank you to our wonderful speakers again, and Helena, Amel, and Charlotte, and all the gang at the Just World Books and Educational, and everyone who attended. Thank you so much for your time and spending it with us during this weekend. Goodbye, everyone, and please fill out the evaluation forms. Thank you, everyone. You all are so awesome.